If you feel like the deck is stacked against you, with everything around you conspiring to make it more difficult to lead, more difficult to keep your family together, and more difficult to raise strong children, you're right. And that's because the system isn't built for strong fathers anymore. It's built to produce passive men, weak families, and broken homes. And the worst part? This didn't happen by accident. In this video, I'll show you exactly how modern society has been restructured to make fatherhood more difficult, and what you need to do to fight back. The biggest, the most essential lessons from the last century. If in the 1950s you were starting a family, you were actually the youngest that anyone had been as a husband and wife in many generations. The baseline ages are 26 and 22 for a man and a woman to get married. So a man is on average 4 years older than his wife. That is our baseline at the turn of the century in the 1900s. Then we went through, we're not going to go point by point, but just put in the back of your mind, then there's World War I, a Great Depression, and World War II breaks out. Now, the other thing you might not have thought about during that time period is we're at the peak of industrialization. We're at the peak of the urban migration from those villages and hamlets, that agricultural lifestyle, into cities. They're just being built for the first time. So it wasn't this luxurious, glamorous place. No, it was just like tenement housing and shacks and people like trying to be as close as they can to wherever some factory was or some port or some mine. And so that urban rush is not what you think of as urban life today. And this was before there were any labor laws, essentially. And so we're not talking 40-hour work weeks. We're talking, instead of 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, we're talking 10 to 12 hours a day. And we're talking 6 days a week. And furthermore, you have to consider what a drastic and dramatic break that was with all of history up to that point. Because for those 10,000 years, when men went to work on the farm, in their village, work was just go outside. It's right there. I can see you in the field, in the orchard. Like, I see you with the sheep on the hill. I can holler to you that it's lunchtime. I can ring a bell. If something goes wrong, I'll send one of the kids out to go get you, right? So this idea of this like norm we've established of like, oh, well, dad just like goes off to work. Dad didn't go off to work. For 10,000 years, dad worked just here at home. And then really at the turn of the century, the 1900s, we for the first time said, we're going to take dad out of the home. And so he'll go home and sleep. And that's about it. Now, that means that if you got married in 1950, guys come back from the war, let's say he's 24 years old in 1950. So that means he was born in 26. That kid grew up without a dad, right? And instead of growing up in a village surrounded with his father every day and surrounded by aunts and uncles and brothers and cousins and grandparents, they had moved to some big city where they didn't know anybody. His father was never around. And so he never even had a male role model and never got to observe, the way generations had before him, a healthy husband-wife dynamic throughout the day. He was just deprived of that experience because of urbanization, industrialization. Oh, and by the way, then he gets shipped off to war. So instead of spending his late adolescence or young adulthood apprenticing or learning a trade or generally like finding himself in society as a young adult, he was busy, fighting the Nazis or Imperial Japanese. And so when he comes back, he neither had role models nor did he have time to find himself. And quickly he settles down with some girl who also had a estranged relationship with her father. And so the two of them then once again hop to some new place because in the 1950s we invented the suburbs. And so some of these guys come back, get the GI Bill, go to college. Some of them go straight into working. But they grew up in isolation. Now they're going to further isolate themselves. They had never had a positive role model. They're the youngest husband and wife in many generations. And so they're by far the least capable parents that up to that point any human family had, any two people had ever created. And so unsurprisingly, when you're a baby boomer, right, you were born in the 50s, essentially, you had the most dysfunctional household that had ever existed up to that point. So a baby boomer born in the 1950s, their parents were the youngest and the least qualified and had the least support because we invented this concept of not just nuclear family isolation, but then individual isolation. And the big win is instead of being in a city full of strangers, now you can be in a suburb full of strangers, and you can keep all those strangers at bay by putting up a white picket fence. Now, there's so many things we could say about what that does to people psychologically, what that did to women of the greatest generation, and how that influenced children of the baby boomer generation. But it's just so important that we understand how much of what went on in that period, in the 1950s, was such a dramatic break from the past, which we had already broken from. We had 10,000 years of essentially a steady way of life for people around the globe, and then we rapidly and dramatically changed it in ways that directly affected the well-being of husbands and wives and children. So, over the course of this narrative I just provided, the U.S. has significantly departed from the global norm. So, you've got a fourth grade class of 20 kids. Globally, you look at the arrangement of those kids, are they going home to an extended family situation? Or are they going home to a two-parent household with no extended family? Or are they going home to a single family household, right? So the global average is that out of 20 kids, 8 of them, almost half, are in an extended family situation. And the next 10, half of them, live in a household with 2 parents. Now, I would submit to you, it's not in the data, but I would submit to you that even if they're living in a 2-parent household, that 2-parent household is geographically closer to extended family and long-term. Like, my uncle lives down the block from us. So that's not in the data, but it's a fair inference. So that what you're really looking at is almost all of them have some kind of like extended family enduring network. And 2 out of the 20 global average are going home to a single parent home, which again doesn't necessarily mean they aren't geographically close to family. Because most of the world didn't go through the urbanization and suburbanization, the urban sprawl that the United States did. It's a peculiar U.S. phenomenon. And so you look at the bottom, and we're a flip, basically. And so only 2 out of the 20 kids in a 4th grade classroom in the U.S., only 2 of those kids go home to an extended family situation, rather than the 8. That's the global average. Now, there are 13 who are in a 2-parent home, but this really means 2 adults. It doesn't necessarily mean your mom and dad, and it doesn't mean that they're married. Because as we'll get to in a subsequent set of data, there's a lot more turbulence in a household for an average child at the time of or leading up to them being in 4th grade, being 9 years old. The likelihood that they have had some kind of turbulence in their home life is much greater in the United States than anywhere else. So there's 13 in that category, and then there's 5 who are going home to a single parent household. And again, more often than it had ever been, even in that single parent situation, that single parent may very well be geographically isolated from any extended family support network. So we were thinking earlier in the previous slide about a family that's starting in 1950. Members of its greatest generation getting married and having kids in 1950 or that decade. Not only did the average age of marriage start climbing again and it surpassed its prior norm, it didn't just return to the average, it like pendulum swung so that people are like 30 now getting married instead of mid-20s or early 20s. Now we're at 30s. But in addition to that, marriage rates went down. I didn't put that slide in this deck, but we all know that marriage rates have gone down. We know that divorce rates have gone up. The other thing that people don't necessarily take into account is that when those baby boomers got to be of age, when they reached young adulthood, remember they were born between 50 and 60. So that means, add 20 years, let's say 75. Well, look at the chart here. As they came of age, starting right around 70, we reached a fever pitch with the rate at which children were being born to unwed mothers. What do we mean by being born to unwed mothers? You can think of many different scenarios. One scenario, 2 people conceive a child, they realize that the woman is pregnant, and they get married. They have some lead time before the child is born. So you could get married now that you know you're pregnant. So this isn't number of conceptions that occurred outside of marriage. This is number of births. And we went from a world back in 1940 where under 5%, less than 5% in that 4th grade class, less than 1 in 20 children would have been born to a mother who was not married. Now we fast forward, and the baby boomers made it cool to have a baby without being married. And they continued to make it cool. They taught those children that it's cool, Gen Xers, which is why you fast forward another 20 years and you get into the 90s, and you have now on the national average is that we have more than 1/3. So 7 or 8 kids in a classroom of fourth graders, 7 or 8 of them were, when they were born, their mom didn't have a husband. Now, at some point later, she might have gotten one. That's a different situation. And she might be cohabitating with somebody, but she's not married to him. And he may or may not be the father. So that is the case now. Instead of 1 out of 20 kids, it's 7 or 8 out of 20 kids were brought up in that situation. Now, you could still say, I see the dominoes. I see how these things are connected. I see the chain of events. But so what? Maybe all of this is fine. Maybe none of this matters and it's purely academic. You take a 1960 classroom. That means that all the moms and dads are the greatest generation, and we've got a classroom full of baby boomers. We're taking that baby boomer when they're 9 years old. They were born in 1951. In 1960, they're in 4th grade. Now, we're going to compare and contrast that classroom of baby boomers to a classroom today of, these are children of millennials today in a 4th grade classroom. And so we want to ask ourselves, how many kids in this classroom, from the time they were born to the time they're in 4th grade, their parents have been married. They've always been married. They're living in a stable marital household. And then the second one is, well, how many of these kids at some point mom was unmarried? Maybe she was unmarried when the child was born, but then she later got married to the dad or to anybody. Maybe she was married when the child was born, but then she got divorced. But at some point, it was just mom. How many kids are in that situation? 1960s, 18 out of the 20 kids, when they were born in 1951, mom was married to dad. And mom has always been married to dad. She's still married to dad. Here I am in 4th grade. I come from a household of 2 married people. They've always been married. And 2 of the kids would have at some point had a single mom situation. At some point up to and including 4th grade. Contrast that with 2020. One thing is we changed the law in the 1960s and we made it okay to just divorce somebody with no reason whatsoever. At 1960, up to this point, you could have gotten a divorce, but you had to convince a judge that you were justified in getting a divorce. You essentially had to point to some poor behavior, some violation of your rights and privileges as a spouse by the other. Like they're not taking care of you, they're being disloyal, they're abusive, whatever it might be. They're unreliable, they're incompetent, they're not responsible. All those things we talked about in human flourishing. If you could demonstrate to a judge in one way or another that there was a failure to cultivate a healthy and flourishing marriage and family life, then you could get a divorce. In 1960, we changed the rules and we said, actually, you don't need any reason. Just if you don't want to be married anymore, you don't have to be married anymore. And so, flash forward, now instead of 18 out of 20 people have always been in a married household, we now have 10 out of every 20. Half of the class has always, their mom and dad have been married since they were born and they're still married as of 4th grade. But then there's 8 kids instead of 2. There's 8 kids now, almost the other half, who at some point have just been living with their mom. Maybe they've always just been living with their mom. Maybe mom was at some point cohabitating, but then they broke up, which happens in 50% of cohabitation up to this age. So up to 4th grade, the stats are that there's a 50% chance if your parents are cohabitating that they will split before you're in 4th grade, before you're 9 years old. Whereas in the case of marriage, there's only a 20% chance, the less than half, that your married parents will split before you reach 4th grade. But in a 2020 classroom, almost half, 8 out of the 20 kids will have at some point, maybe at that point, be living with just their mom, no dad. And then the other 2 are in the situation of, well, I live with my mom and a man who may or may not be my dad, but they're not married. That's 2 out of the 20 kids. Again, I'm saying one major change, geography. Second major change, the greatest generation, the parents of the baby boomers, the ones who were the moms and the dads in 1960, were the least qualified and the least supported husbands and wives, mothers and fathers humanity had ever seen before, around the world or throughout time. They had the least on-the-job training, the least mentorship, the least support. They were the most estranged from their parents, as well as their extended family and community, and most especially from their fathers. They grew up and they normalized being divorced, cohabitating, raising a child without a father. You could say none of this really matters. This is just like academic and doesn't mean anything. As long as we're flourishing as families and as communities and as individuals, we're flourishing. It doesn't really matter. Marriage is just a piece of paper kind of stuff. You can say that. So let's look at what are the consequences of this situation. We're going to hypothesize the better outcomes for people by having fewer constraints on them, less accountability. They have to be less obedient to an authority figure, like the rules. There are fewer rules that they have to obey. We're going to give them a lot more slack in how they organize their lives and live their lives. We're going to set up a society where children can be raised by just women. They're not dependent on a man. Women can get divorced for any reason they want. Are we better off? As of 1970, men and women reported happiness. In general, how satisfied would you say you personally are with your life? The greatest generation is becoming empty nesters, and baby boomers are young adults. They're coming of age. Back then, men and women, pretty happy. Then we changed. That is the time that we made a bunch of policy changes. We made it legal to get divorced for any reason. We changed a bunch of labor laws. Okay, so that's the setup in 1970. We've begun the experiment in full swing. We got the idea in our head in the 1950s because our moms and dads were so dysfunctional. We had dysfunctional households. And so then we said, we don't want to live like this. So we're going to change all these rules come 20 years from now. So it's 1970. We change all the rules. We start the experiment. Everybody's pretty happy. And then we see that every decade people get less happy. It used to be women were a little happier than men, but then both men and women got less happy over the next 10 years. And then 10 more years went by and they were even less happy. And then by the time we get into the 1990s, people are not just less happy, they're actually unhappy. Both men and women are actually unhappy. And even more than that, women got more unhappy faster than men did. In the 70s, women were a little happier than men. Everybody was pretty happy. Once we break into the mid-90s, nobody's happy. And women have lost a lot more happiness than men have. So when we're asking the question, why does any of the data matter? What do any of these changes mean? What it means is it makes everybody unhappy. Men and women are worse off today after implementation of these policies. But then you could say, well, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad for the kids. That's true. It doesn't necessarily mean that. But the good news is we have data on that too. We have data on childhood outcomes. In 1960, in a fourth grade classroom, 1 out of 20 would have been obese. Now we've quadrupled that up to 4 kids now. Instead of 1, there's now 4 kids who are obese. And you have a curve, and instead of 1 kid being way out on the edge, it's like, no, we've shifted the whole curve. And now 4 kids in that 20-kid classroom are obese, which means a whole bunch more are unhealthy and overweight. They just qualify as obese. And so only a minority are a healthy weight. I'm not giving you the exhaustive tour today. I'm just trying to give you some of the highlights, connect some of the big dots, and see the pattern. But it's not just physical health. Also, mental health of children has continued to decline at an accelerating rate. We can quibble about the details and the exceptions to the rules, but the data is in. We've been running an experiment for the past 75 years, ever since the greatest generation came back from war, settled down in the suburbs. They raised the baby boomers. We started an experiment. And the control is not 1950. That was the experiment. This is where everybody gets messed up. Everybody thinks 1950 is the baseline. It's not the baseline. We'd already begun the experiment. The baseline is 10,000 years of agrarian, small-town living. Then we had the industrial experiment, and then we had the information age experiment, the suburbia experiment. Now, the data is in. We have the data. And here are some things we can say with high degree of confidence. The first thing we can say is that children do better. Their outcomes are better. They're healthier, happier. Their mental health is better when mom and dad are married. A child of mom and dad being married has a better, more fulfilling, happier life than a child whose parents are not. All other things being equal. The other thing is women who are married are happier with their lives than mothers who are unmarried. The children are better off. There's a direct link between a happy mom and a child's positive outcomes. So marriage benefits the child directly, the stability of the marriage. Marriage benefits the woman directly. She's happier. And her happiness also benefits the children. So the child gets a twofer. The next thing we know, the data show that the more time and attention that the father gives to the children, the better the child's outcomes are. the better their cognitive development, the better their social development, the fewer obstacles and challenges and difficulties they'll experience in adolescence, and the higher their mental health, the higher their academic outcomes. Not that I care about academic outcomes per se, but it's an indicator of their ability to function well, right, through childhood and adolescence. The more time and attention that their father is able to give to them, the better their outcomes. Now, we didn't talk about this yet in this video. It is another study for another video. But the other thing is that checklist there, and that represents accountability. Children do better when their mother is happier, and they do better when they are held accountable by their father. Part of the time and attention that the father is giving to the children is holding them accountable, because as we went back to our triangle of flourishing, being held accountable and having to obey is the mechanism by which the individual develops competence and responsibility for themselves. And so the more time and attention the father is able to give to the children, the stronger their relationship, yes, but also the more competence and responsibility they develop through the accountability that the father is providing. So we know all that. That's a bunch of information about what benefits children with regard to their mother and father, the relationship between them, and how they interact with the child. The next set of things we know in the bottom left-hand corner there is spending more time in institutional care, like school or formal extracurriculars, spending more time in a classroom setting with rigid structures and regimented routines, and spending time with modern technology on the internet. All those things are bad for a child's outcome. Too much school, too much extracurriculars, and too much social media reduces childhood outcomes. Everything gets worse. Health, mental health, happiness, driven down by those features. What drives up childhood outcomes in terms of their lifestyle, their day-to-day, is the more responsibility they have, the more autonomy they have, and the more they have the opportunity to exercise their own agency, which is what that little piggy bank represents. If they have some kind of chores or some kind of job in their adolescent years, that directly leads to higher confidence, esteem, and responsibility for yourself, competence that you develop by being responsible in an unstructured way. Like you're out in the wild, you're having to run a lemonade stand or deliver papers, not I'm in a classroom. Being held accountable for doing your homework is not the same thing as getting to do something entrepreneurial or in an apprenticeship intern kind of sense. But beyond that, children's mental health, well-being, and outcomes as they enter adulthood are increased by the more time they spend in unstructured environments with their peers, unsupervised time. So instead of dropping the kid off at an extracurricular at the school or at the youth center for an hour and a half, if you take your kid to the playground for an hour and a half and they run free with the other kids, if the latter is your default, your child will be better off long term. Their mental health will improve. If you read your book in the car while they're playing on the playground and you're not hovering over them, they turn out better if they have more time like that, unstructured time with their peers, than if you try to substitute supervised structured extracurricular times. It does not deliver positive outcomes. If you're really saying that you just reject all of this data, you just reject all of this reasoning, all these inferences, you're like, no, none of this is real, and until it's airtight, I'm not interested in hearing any of this, right? Well, then I would submit to you that you're exhibiting a toxic mindset that prevents you from navigating the world effectively. Which, going back to our framework, we're talking up here at a high level about human flourishing, but in order to get to that level, we've got to have a shared foundation there at the ground level of mental fitness, of practical and systematic framework for how you think about what you know and how you know it, and what you think is credible, and what authorities or experts or data you're willing to accept and under what circumstances. Many people today have developed and embraced a sort of one-sided skepticism where they set a very high threshold for the evidence that they demand people provide to make a case they don't want to hear. And they set little or no barriers to people and arguments that they intuitively agree with They accept those with no evidence. And so I'm not trying here to provide evidence that will overcome that kind of irrational, one-sided ideological barrier. I'm trying rather to provide information to people who are receptive and primed to understand, yes, it is obvious that marriages, families, and child outcomes are getting worse. And I'm interested in knowing what's causing it. I'm interested in knowing what things under my control can I toggle or adjust in order to improve the outcomes for my children. And as we're going to get to here in the next section, what are the big moves I can make so that my family today and the next generation to come after me, my children's marriages and my grandchildren's childhoods can be better? How can we learn from this 75-year experiment? But we've got to recognize, in order to have a worthwhile and productive conversation, we've got to be working on some compatible level of how we philosophically think about what can we know and how do we know it, and how much should we rely on our intuition versus experts versus tradition versus data. There's a range of answers within that, but then there's a lot of wrong answers on the extremes that prevent people from taking the data seriously. They are ideologically blinded to what is right in front of us. We have the data that shows that the policies and lifestyles that we put in place 75 years ago have led to negative outcomes. The data is in. The experiment has completed. Now it's just a question of what we're going to do about it, because I have learned through the School of Hard Knocks, through failed attempts to have productive dialogues with people who hold fundamentally broken worldviews and philosophical premises, ideological commitments that keep them from having a rational discussion. I have learned that in order to have a community of people working together, sharing information and upgrading one another's models so that they can move through that OODA loop more quickly and more effectively, all of that must be predicated on a foundational mutual understanding of basic beliefs and values about human nature, and basic alignment, or at least compatibility with, what is our understanding of our roles and responsibilities, our vision for cultivating a healthy marriage and family life as men. So the creed, it draws some line, what is in and what is out of bounds for what your philosophical starting point is. Check it out yourself at mr-homemaker.com. That's where you're seeing this creed. It's here. You go to the homepage, mr-homemaker.com. And that is how the creed came to be, is in order to create a gated community of people who at least have valid and compatible worldviews that will allow them to follow where the reasoning as well as data take us for how to reverse the negative trends that our marriages and families and children are experiencing. So now you see the reality. This system wasn't designed to make fatherhood easy or effective. It was designed to take fatherhood out of the equation. But now is the real question. What can you do about it? What can you do to start taking back control? That's exactly what we'll cover in the next video. Use the link on your screen or the pinned comment below, because knowing how this problem came to be isn't enough. You need to know how to fix it.